So hello and welcome. My name's Steve Nobel, and today I'm speaking with Megan Feldman Betancourt on her book. The subtitle actually, Forgiveness in an Unforgiving World. And Megan is an award-winning journalist who's reported from many countries. She gives talks on how to foster seeking and granting of forgiveness to diffuse conflict and prevent violence and nurture health and well-being. She's the author of Triumph of the Heart, Forgiveness in an Unforgiving World. She lives in Denver with her husband and son, and her website is meganfeldman.com. This link will go out with the podcast. Hi, Megan.
Hi, Steve. Thank you for having me.
So I've been reading your book. It's quite an in-depth, powerful read, really, but lots of very moving stories. It's really an exploration of forgiveness, but what sparked the whole thing off?
So I was actually not really into forgiveness and never thought I would write about it. I was a journalist who covered pretty gritty topics, and forgiveness, if I thought about it, I thought it seemed kind of out there, maybe kind of wimpy. And what happened was I did a national magazine story about a man named Azim Khamisa, and Azim had lost his only son to a shooting, and he ended up forgiving fairly soon after. He forgave the teenager. It was actually a 14-year-old boy who killed his son. And he became very close to that boy's grandfather. And they started a nonviolence education organization that's now reached more than 9 million children. So I got to spend a few weeks with Azim and with this organization. And it really struck me. At the time, I was kind of going through a bitter period personally. I'd been through a breakup. I was kind of struggling to pay my bills as a journalist because the industry was changing so rapidly. And I just wanted to know more because Azim really said, he talked about how forgiving his son's murderer was crucial to being able to survive that loss and create a meaningful life. And that really moved me. And I wanted to know more. And I wanted to know more about, okay, well, is there science that really shows that this is a benefit, for our bodies, for our psychology and our minds? So I looked into that. And then I found that, yes, there is a lot of scientific evidence showing that forgiveness really is important for our physical and our psychological health. And so then I wanted to know, okay, well, if that's true, which was kind of a bummer for me to hear because I kind of liked my grudges. I thought, if that's true, well, how does it play out in a variety of situations, interpersonally and collectively around the world? And that kind of became this quest that turned into my book.
Wow. Well, I don't know if you've heard of these people, but many years ago, probably about 15 years ago, I attended a talk by Jo Berry. She's the daughter of a Conservative MP who was killed by an IRA bomb. And she did a talk in a church with the bomber, actually, Patrick McGee, who'd kind of been let out. And they were together, again, forming a peace project and talking around the country on forgiveness, the bomber and the daughter of the MP that was killed. Very interesting, actually.
Amazing.
Very powerful.
Yes, I can only imagine. I'm familiar with that story, although I have not met her.
Right. In your book, you say, in the collective mind, forgiveness is often confused with words such as pardon, excuse, or condone. And I would add, letting off the hook, that kind of thing. This is why I'm not going to let them off the hook. And that even happens in personal relationship, isn't it? If you've got a grudge against someone, I'm not going to let them off the hook. I'm just still be angry with them.
Right.
What about that kind of difference between forgiveness and letting off the hook?
Yeah. I think it's important to recognize first that the definition of forgiving is to release resentment. So if you think about releasing resentment, we can do that and have boundaries, and we can release our resentment and take a stand for justice or seek justice, if someone has violated us and certainly broken the law. But when it comes to these definitions that are kind of collapsed, like you say, I think a lot of it goes back to organized religion, which, of course, a lot of organized religions, most of them have wonderful practices that we can use to practice our forgiveness muscles. And that's great. However, in the dogmatic forms of organized religion, forgiveness has oftentimes been used as a weapon, actually. for example, against victims, so say people who have been victimized by priests, or even, abused by just elders in a community. Oftentimes, the people with the power in that community have said, oh, well, in order to be good and virtuous and get into heaven, you have to forgive. And by the way, forgiving means you don't tell anyone this happened. You certainly don't report it to law enforcement. And so we have this kind of Gordian knot of things that people think forgiveness means. And that, I think, was why I thought it was like being a doormat, right? Like if I forgive, that means that, like you say, I'm letting someone off the hook and not holding them accountable. So that's why I think it's very important to be clear about our definitions, right? To forgive is release resentment. That doesn't mean that you have someone over for Thanksgiving dinner if it doesn't work for you, right? If it's a toxic, hurtful, ongoing behavior that is, just a source of pain in your life, you can set down a boundary and say, I absolutely forgive this person and I'm releasing resentment. I'm setting an intention to do that. I'm committed to that. And I'm not going to sit and chat with them at Thanksgiving.
Right. Yeah, I got it. Well, one of the things that really jumped out at me, you said in your book, as I researched this chapter, I think it was early on in the book, I came to understand there's important distinctions between anger and bitterness. This is kind of what you're talking about, I think, and anger and resentment. Maya Angelou described this beautifully in a video conversation with comedian Dave Chappelle. They discussed the friends she'd lost to assassinations, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. And she said, and Chappelle says, I think if it were me, I would be angry. And Angelou looks at him in silent, thoughtful ways, saying, if you're not angry, you're either a stone or you're too sick to be angry. You should be angry. You should not, or you must not be bitter. And this seems to be a key point, not to suppress anger, but not to allow it to sweep us into bitterness and hatred. I mean, that's really key. How do we feel the anger, but not allow it to sweep us into this bitterness and hatred, which so many people are swept into, because there's so much stuff going on in the world, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. It's I love that exchange, and I love that quote from her. First, I'll say, that expression, hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
So much of bitterness, when we're wronged, when trauma happens, and I will say that I'm the daughter of a trauma psychologist who is in her 80s. My mother's in her 80s and she's still practicing.
Right.
And so I've learned a lot from her about the importance of grief and the importance of feeling it to heal it, as people say in the recovery community, that you have to feel it to heal it. Yeah. So anger is an absolutely understandable, normal, and important response to betrayal, to abuse, to being hurt, to being disappointed, right? Like anger is a critical emotion. It's very important, and it serves a purpose. And so part of the problem is that we resist it, many of us, and we try to move past it. Oh, we're beyond anger. We're just going to transcend that. And well, no, we have to feel it. It's important. And so that means grieving. I mean, really, anger is a part of grief. So if we're talking about a major trauma or a major loss, you can't, there's no way around the grief. There's no spiritual bypass. There's no skipping it. We have to feel it and we have to be with it. However, this is the mindfulness piece, is we have to be able to feel it fully in order to let it go. And I think resisting it is what leads us to be pulled into that unconscious reactivity that you're talking about, when you talk about acting from hate, for example, or acting out in rage. For example, Azim, who lost his son to this murder, he talks very eloquently about how he felt he felt rage about the fact that he had immigrated to the US to escape violence, actually. And he lost his son to America's street violence. He was angry about it. And he could have taken revenge, right? He could have unconsciously reacted from that feeling, as opposed to sitting with it and processing it and being with it. And that is what enabled him to proactively and intentionally take action. And the action he took was, of course, the kind of action that Maya Angelou was talking about when she talks about, what do you do about anger? You do everything about it. You sing it, you march it, you dance it, you write it. And that's what Azim did, right? He very consciously, not reactively, created an organization that teaches peace and nonviolence to children.
Well, and when I read that story, I mean, most of the people I think around him also found it quite extraordinary that he was so quickly able to do that.
Yes.
Was that partly due to some religious practice or upbringing, or how did he come to that point? You know, some people may take years to come to that point. He
Right.
got there quite quickly.
That's true. He does say that it's part of his spirituality. He's from a Muslim. He's from Kenya, and he would say that he's very spiritual and not religious. And yet it was like a stroke of insight or an epiphany for him, where when he found out that his son had died, he actually passed out in his kitchen. And when he came to, there was this phrase in his mind, and the phrase was, there were victims on both sides of the gun. He just heard it like that, and for him it was that was from God. There were victims on both sides of the gun, and intuitively he just knew that he had to forgive.
Yeah, because when I read about the boy who actually shot his son, it read like, you know, hey, the whole thing about gang violence and I have to be tough and everything. But I remember there was a moment where I think his grandfather handed him a tangerine or something, and he broke down. There was him again, rather than the hardened, I've got to prove myself type of thing.
Yes.
And it's quite amazing how these two people came together, and you know, it's very unusual, I would say. Very rare that kind of thing would happen. Wouldn't you find in your research that this is kind of a rare thing?
Yes, I think in cases of really extreme trespasses, you know, like in his case, murder, or in Rwanda, for example, where, you know, I spent several weeks talking with survivors and perpetrators of the genocide. You know, these are extreme examples, and it is, I would say, yes, it is extraordinary and it is rare. However, there are environments and practices that pull for that response, as opposed to, you know, just the reactive, let's perpetuate violence response.
Yeah. Well, in your book, you say one of the most surprising discoveries I made was forgiveness is just as inherent, just as evolutionary, hardwired into human nature as aggression and revenge. That is quite a strong statement, because I would think most people would raise an eyebrow at that statement.
Yeah, it's true. So what the evolutionary biologists have argued on that point is that as humans evolved from, you know, bands of nomadic tribes kind of roaming around and hunting and gathering, to more agrarian societies and more complex societies, collaboration became evolutionarily adaptive.
Yeah.
And collaboration became really, really important for our survival, you know, that you couldn't do it alone as societies became more complex. And therefore, there's an argument there that forgiveness is actually a tool that developed as a way to broker collaboration, which is so important for our survival.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. I mean, yes. Can I ask you, what do you think that we talked about religious practices and perhaps also touching on spiritual practices, but you know, you might get a number of people doing those practices, but some people may react quickly and get out of it quickly, like Azim, and others may take years. So it seems to be there's the practice, but there's something inherent in the person, or maybe their upbringing or where they've come from. Did you find that in looking at this?
Yes. So actually, one big factor is that people who are more naturally optimistic tend to be able to forgive more easily, whereas those of us who are more naturally pessimistic tend to be grudge holders. And that's me. I'm definitely in that group of my brain really is more naturally wired for pessimism. And so for me, it takes more work. It takes more intention. It takes more work to build those neural pathways of letting it go, moving forward, creating something new, all of those things.
Gosh, that's interesting. Well, I might be able to forgive quite quickly then, because I've trained myself to be optimistic and upbeat over the last 30 years as a practice, because I had depression earlier on, and I just had this practice. And I have had instances where people have said, you know, that conversation we had last week, well, I'm still blah, blah, blah. And I go, what conversation? I've forgotten. I've completely forgotten the conversation, or that
Right.
thing that was, we were having a little bit of a hard time. And I'm like, when? I can't remember it. I'm so not, it just takes, and I have to be reminded. It's kind of, I suppose it's a benefit, but it could also be not a benefit.
I love it. Well, it's a testament to how much work you've done. And
Right.
yeah, I think it's phenomenal.
Well, that's, well, thank you for that. Let's hope that's a good one. But the person saying, you've forgotten? How have you forgotten? It's such a big deal. Oh, okay. Well, let me ask you, in terms of spirituality, like you mentioned mindfulness. Mindfulness is, and the Buddhist, particularly, I think Buddhist practice, isn't it? Because I
Yeah.
don't think Buddhists rarely go to war, whereas, Christianity, Islam have been quite warlike over many, many years. But Buddhism, mindfulness, I've been to Plum Village, Thich Nhat Hanh. There's a whole sense of peace and non-harmfulness, isn't there? Animals, the whole practice. Do you find, have you looked at different religions or different practices such as mindfulness? I mean, you mentioned it earlier.
Yes, I think it's really, really powerful. One of the reasons why it's powerful is that it builds the daily muscle. If you put mindfulness in as a habit, mindfulness meditation, and just being mindful throughout the day, it's
Yeah.
constantly building the muscle of observing your ego states. I mean, that's what my mom would say as a psychologist, right? But I would say it's getting in touch with your higher self as an observer of your little self, right? Because we all have our young child selves within us, and they react, they get scared, they get upset, our
Yeah.
feelings get hurt. And so when we can be mindful about observing our reactions and our feelings and our thoughts, as opposed to being them, that is extraordinarily powerful. And it helps us to notice, oh, there's that angry reaction. There it is. And when we notice it in that moment, we're not getting sucked down the river of rage.
Yeah. Well, I guess resentment and bitterness adds to our stress. If we're thinking constantly, there's going to be a stress reaction inside of us. And you have mentioned in your book that you looked at some of the kind of scientific research into releasing and forgiving. And what have you found in terms of actually it's for the most logical person going, well, I don't know if I need to do this. Why should I do this?
Yeah.
Well, there are health benefits. What are they?
Well, the first body of research that's quite old, actually, and well established, I mean, probably at least 50 years, is the impact of long-term resentment and anger on the heart. So,
Oh, yeah.
that, people who hold grudges over time, that really makes you more likely to have heart issues. And it can even make a cardiac event more intense than it would have been.
Mm.
And then on the flip side, forgiveness practices, the literature and the research around forgiveness as a practice is a little bit newer. I would say 25, maybe starting in the mid to late 90s. But that shows that people who do forgiveness practices actually are able to increase blood flow to the heart and reduce the magnitude of a heart event. So that's really big. And then the second, after the research around heart health, the second would be around brain health and mood health. So we know that people who tend to be angry or hold grudges, be resentful, over time, what that does is that it's constantly sparking that stress response you mentioned, which in the brain, that means adrenaline, norepinephrine, and other stress chemicals are flooding our brains. And those actually inhibit the frontal lobe's ability to problem solve. And over time, that makes us more likely to be depressed and anxious.
Right.
Again, on the flip side, forgiveness practices have been shown to reduce symptoms of anxiety and depression. So it's very clear that whether we're talking about heart health or brain and mood health, forgiveness is really important.
'Cause I did some training years ago, counseling training, I think, basically, and in the counseling training, she said two of the biggest factors in depression is suppressing grief and anger. And I was like, wow, which would be the flip side, people who are not raging, but they're just suppressing that rage, just kind
Yes,
of blocking it down. So there's
that's
also, what about the immune system? Is there any research on actually our immune systems are happier and healthier and we can live longer as a result of, anything like any knock-on effect on our
well,
immune system?
yes. Well, we know that stress has a huge effect on the immune system. So if you are feeling angry and resentful, or you're suppressing that, that creates stress. And again, that stress response is that kind of fight or flight, norepinephrine, adrenaline, cortisol flooding the brain. And so, yes, stress in the form of being angry and upset is going to increase your susceptibility to any number of diseases, because the immune system is not functioning, at its best. And on the other hand, like you mentioned, if you can reduce that stress, which forgiveness does, then yes, you're helping your immune system along quite a bit.
Let's change the tack slightly. I know you've done a little bit of research into the war. I mean, particularly there's the recent war, Gaza, which is dreadful. The news coming out, on social media and everything. What have you found in terms like areas like that where this has been going on for maybe back to the 40s, I think, between Israelis and Palestinians. What about these major conflicts and forgiveness, the role of forgiveness in these kind of things?
Mhm. Yeah, it's, I would say that in an active conflict like this one, I would not bring up the word forgiveness.
Yeah,
And the reason for that is, if I had a psychologist friend who said to me when I first started researching the book, if someone's standing on your toe, you don't say, "Oh, I forgive you." You say, "Get off." Right.
yeah,
So when you have a situation where people are literally standing on each other's toes and actively hurting each other, the first step is pulling them apart and, a ceasefire, ending the conflict, pausing the conflict, and talking and starting
yeah,
to figure out with some sort of political logistical solution and path forward to peace. However, having said that, there are definitely practices that can lay the groundwork for forgiveness. And I would say one of those is, I mean, there's a lot of them, but I'll mention a couple. So one would be listening in order to understand, as opposed to listening to respond or react or
yeah,
argue or attack, right?
yeah,
And we're seeing this the United States big time. I think I don't know about in the UK as much, but just so many people are affected by this conflict in the Middle
mm,
East and
yeah,
reacting to it. And a lot of it is the us versus them mentality, right? Of this side is wrong or that side is wrong, that side is less than human or that side is
mm,
less than human. And then you're only listening to argue, right?
yeah,
Or to put a stake in the ground and say these people are wrong or whatever it is. So listening to understand instead of persuade, I think, is a big one. The other one is, so when we talk about forgiveness, there's a practice called re-examining your victim narrative.
yeah,
So interpersonally, that looks like, I'm making this up, say I had a relative who was abusive towards me when I was a kid. And
yeah,
as an adult, I start to look at this pattern of victimization and ask, okay, where was this person coming from? Where might their headspace have been? Was
mm,
this person who was abusive, did they have some kind of challenge? Did they have a substance misuse disorder, right? So you start to kind of look at and try to understand where the person was and what would have led them to act that way. And
yeah,
it takes you out of your own sense of victimhood and purity and more into trying to get into someone else's shoes, right?
yeah,
So I think that would be helpful if the sides or whatever side people identify with, in this case of the war in the Middle East,
mm,
could start to really do the work. And it's not easy. It's not easy, but to do the work of okay, why is the other side, what are their arguments? Why would they think that? What have they experienced that might lead them to think that?
Yeah.
And then we can kind of start getting back on a path towards a common humanity, right? A common, really trying to focus on what we have in common as opposed to what divides us.
I think they're very powerful practices, really, and they can also be applied at a personal level. Listening to understand. I mean, I think England is the same as America, maybe not quite as extreme, but the whole, listening to the politics in England and America, it's the same, the arguing, listening to argue, and the whole divide between, well, who do you support? Are you supporting them or do you support them? I
Right.
think it's happening in a lot of Western countries. It's really shaken up this, particularly, I think, even more than Ukraine, I think, has really divided people into who are you supporting. And of course, there's no reconciliation between two groups of people marching, waving flags, and saying we are right. I suppose in
Right.
America, it's a bit like we support Trump or we don't,
Oh yeah,
and there's no middle
absolutely.
ground.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. Well, look, Megan, thank you so much for speaking, and thank you. And I wish your book all the best, Triumph of the Heart. Are you doing many talks and going around and spreading the word?
Thank you so much. Yes, I have been doing Zoom talks and some in-person ones, podcast interviews, and it's always an honor and a privilege for me to talk about forgiveness and be able to talk with someone like you who's doing such amazing work. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Well, you too. And I guess you're still doing are you doing the journalism bit still? Are you still going around doing that?
I don't travel much anymore. So I have a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I mostly am at home, working from home. But I do still write articles and essays, and my job is in communications and marketing. So
Okay.
still pretty active, but not traveling and adventuring quite as much as I used to.
Could be very useful dealing with two young children, I'm sure. Communication
Yes.
skills.
Yes, we do a lot of restorative practices and forgiveness practices with the kids.
Yeah, that was my toy you broke. I mean, I'm a grandfather now, so I'm like still going through it really. But yeah. All right,
Yeah.
Megan. Well, thanks so much and good luck with the book.
Thank you so much. Wonderful talking with you.